Florida was the third state to secede from the Union. Florida was a young state, having been admitted to the Union in 1845. Her population was 140,000 when war broke out, with almost half the population being enslaved. Florida's most populous city was Pensacola at 2,800 residents. Out of the 140,000 residents of Florida, 15,000 would serve in the American Civil War, a small number compared to most other states. Even most of the border states, who never left the Union, had more people join the Confederate Army than Florida. Missouri had 30,000 men join the Confederate Army. Kentucky had 35,000. Maryland had 25,000. But Florida's population was small, just 41,000 white men in the state at the start of the war in 1861. The state was mostly forgotten by the Confederacy in the early years, until later on when the Confederacy relied on Florida for cattle, pork, corn, salt, and molasses. Florida was hard to protect with its 1,350-mile coastline. It had very few railroads, and its population was spread out. December 15, 1863, Major General Gillmore, in charge of the Department of the South, proposed the Florida Campaign to Major General Halleck. The main objectives in the campaign would be ultimately returning Florida to the Union, or at least parts of the state that the North wanted, cut off supplies to the rest of the Confederacy, since Florida had taken up a large role in being the breadbasket of the South, especially in Alachua and Marion counties. Also, the recruitment of African American slaves. Florida had a population of around 140,000 at the start of the war. Almost 44% were slaves. L.D. Stickney, the tax commissioner in Florida, might have been the one who came up with the idea for the Florida campaign. After Lincoln's proclamation of amnesty in 1863, Stickney wanted the occupation of Florida. He had petitions signed and even met with Lincoln about this. The Amnesty Proclamation offered a full pardon to people in the South. They needed to take an oath of loyalty and accept the abolishing of slavery. They would get their rights back along with their property, just not their slaves. The 10% plan would let Southern states rejoin the Union if 10% of its voters took an oath to the Constitution. On December 22, 1863, Major General Gillmore received a letter giving him the authority to carry out operations in Florida. President Lincoln even wrote Gillmore in January about wanting to establish a government in Florida and asking for Gillmore to help with Reconstruction. Gillmore gave his objectives to Halleck. 1. Procuring an outlet for the products of the state. 2. Cut off the enemy's source of commissary supplies. 3. Secure recruits for colored regiments. And 4. Inaugurate measures for the restoration of Florida to allegiance in accordance with the desires of the President. Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard was tipped off about the Union troops' movements. He was in charge of Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina. He told his units to be on guard and let him know if any movements were spotted. Brigadier General Truman Seymour received orders for his men to board transports before daylight on the 6th in February. This included the famous 54th Massachusetts, one of the first colored units of the Civil War. Each man was given 60 rounds of ammunition upon departure. They reached the St. Johns River on the 7th and made their way up to Jacksonville. They were fired on once by a Confederate picket. That was the only action while going up the St. Johns River until reaching Jacksonville. The Confederates sunk a steamer and burned barrels of cotton. They reached a part of Jacksonville that was in Union control on the 8th. That afternoon, Colonel Barton, Colonel Hawley, and Colonel Henry's brigades set off. Camp Finnegan was 8 miles out. Colonel McCormick and 350 men retreated from the camp before the Union arrived. The Union captured 4 guns at 12 Mile Station. Colonel Henry's brigade reached Baldwin in the morning and occupied the town. Confederate Brigadier General Joseph Finnegan told Beauregard about the Union landing at Jacksonville. Forces were sent out from Savannah, Middle Florida, and Charleston to assist. Colonel Henry set off to Barber's Plantation on the 10th, meeting Confederates, and a skirmish broke out. Union casualties were around 3 killed and 10 wounded. Confederate casualties were 2 killed and 2 wounded. An account on the Union side is in the Oscar G. Sawyer's dispatches. It reads, "To the vicinity of Lake City, and its brilliant successive, routing and pursuing the enemy and destroying a large amount of valuable supplies of the rebel army, our forces have met the rebels in strength, in a strong position, chosen by themselves and fortified. In this engagement, our forces came out second best with a considerable loss in men and material. The battle was one of the most furious and bloody of any that has yet taken place in this department, which is already famous for the carnage on both sides that has marked nearly every engagement fought within its borders. What its ultimate result may be, time alone can decide. It is quite certain that although our losses were quite heavy, and the advantage rather in favor of the enemy, the morale of our men is unimpaired, and their willingness to meet the enemy as perfect as ever. No men could be more eager for work, and no men better able to endure hardships than they, although they have not, as a general thing, been accustomed to heavy marches. A few days only are wanted to rest the troops, repair damages, and make other needed arrangements, and our brave fellows will again move against the enemy, or successfully meet him, should he dare to advance." Henry reached the small town of Sanderson that night. 1,500 bushels of corn were burned before they arrived. They stayed the night, and Hawley arrived on the 11th. Oscar G. Sawyer's dispatches described their arrival. The troops were in motion at an early hour, the light cavalry in advance. The line of march was across the south prong of the St. Mary's, and up the road to Sanderson, 9 miles distant. The day was beautiful as ever dawned. A clear sky was over us, and the savannas that stretched out on either side of the sandy road, which wound through the pine woods, and warm with the golden sunlight, pouring through the resinous pine tops, and lending to the air a balmy fragrance. Our men marched off, with a light step, joyful with the very idea of meeting the enemy. The march to Sanderson was made without a halt of movement, and the men seemed as fresh and vigorous as ever at that point. At Sanderson, the infantry halted, the cavalry preserving their relative distance at about 2 miles in the advance. After a short rest, the column again moved forward, the cavalry, under Major Stevens, feeling their way along cautiously and ever ready for action. Around the same time, Finnegan had troops from Middle Florida arrive at Lake City. He had 490 infantry, 110 cavalry, and 2 artillery pieces. On the 11th, Union cavalry set off towards Lake City and skirmished with the Confederates, then went back to Sanderson. Oscar G. Sawyer's dispatches described the skirmish. The advanced cavalry force first came upon the enemy pickets at Sawmill, near the railroad, and on the right of it, about 6 miles from Sanderson. They consisted of about 75 cavalrymen, who dismounted and deployed as skirmishers, and as our advance approached, they crossed the railroad in front and fired several volleys of musketry. The cavalry replied with their carbines and continued to advance rapidly. The enemy, finding affairs growing too warm for their comfort, hastily recrossed the railroad, mounted their horses, and rapidly retreated towards Lake City. Our cavalry did not pursue. Gilmore did not want Seymour to advance again and to fall back to Baldwin. On the 13th, they fell back to Barber's Plantation, but did not go back to Baldwin. A raid on Gainesville set off on the 14th, but returned on the 17th empty-handed. Confederate Captain Dickinson of the 2nd Florida Cavalry stopped the raid. On the 14th, a raiding party damaged bridges and the railroad at Callahan. Confederate Brigadier General Finnegan took his forces and marched to Olustee Station. He believed this was their only option for a strong defense. Ocean Pond was on one side, and a large swamp on the other. The troops dug trenches. They had 1,800 infantry, 450 cavalry, and 2 artillery batteries. Brigadier General Gilmore believed going on to Lake City without a train was not admissible, and that Florida would not come back to the Union unless more successes were made elsewhere. He wanted the forces to fall back and occupy Palatka and Jacksonville. Meanwhile, Finnegan was reinforced from Beauregard by Confederate troops from Georgia and South Carolina. Finnegan's forces were now 4,600 infantry, 450 cavalry, 3 artillery batteries with 12 guns. On the 19th, Seymour ordered his troops to prepare to move on the next day, 5,500 officers and men with 16 guns. The next morning, they left Barber's plantation at 6 a.m. Colonel Henry's brigade and Elder's battery led the march. At 7 a.m., Colonel Hawley's brigade and Hamilton's battery, Colonel Barrington's brigade, Langdon's brigade, and the wagon train led by Colonel Montgomery. At 2 p.m., the column spotted Confederate cavalry pickets. The 7th Connecticut skirmished with the Confederate advance guard. Union artillery fired in an area they believed the Confederates were and received artillery fire in return. Seymour ordered his reserves in, and a line extended 300 yards long. The area was flat and open, with pine trees and little undergrowth. Oscar G. Sawyer's dispatches describe the start of the battle. Advancing as he fired, Colonel Henry's cavalry was thrown out on either side to support the gun, and a force halted in the rear for the same purpose. The skirmishing now becoming rather lively. Elder brought his other pieces into position on the left of the road and opened a heavy fire upon the enemy, who replied with artillery and musketry, the fire growing rather too hot for us, and the enemy pushing forward a heavy line of skirmishers. After a short contest, our line fell back and took up the second position. Again, Elder's battery was placed by Colonel Henry on the left of the road, and the cavalry thrown out on either side to protect the flanks of the line and support the battery. A section of Hamilton's battery was now brought forward and placed on Elder's left and a little to his front, and was speedily in play, increasing the chorus of the brazen voices of the cannon. The 7th New Hampshire, Colonel Abbott of Colonel Hawley's brigade, was marched in column, the left in front to a position on the right, and began to deploy in line of battle. They found themselves right in the face of the enemy's line of battle, before which no rebel skirmishers had been thrown out. Before they could get in line, the enemy poured in several withering volleys of musketry, which cut down many men. The enemy's sharpshooters were particularly active and exceedingly harassing in the peculiar operations. The men began to drop so rapidly under this fire that the line was scarcely deployed before it wavered and broke, in spite of Colonel Abbott's strenuous efforts to rally them and hold them to their work, and fell back in disorder after firing a few answering volleys. On the advance of the 7th New Hampshire and the 8th United States Colored Troops, Colonel Fribley was sent to the left to support the artillery. The mounted infantry, Captain Jenkinson's commanding, fell back 150 yards and took up a position on the right and left flanks of the line of battle, the left flank resting across the railroad. The Battle of Olustee now began in earnest, and the firing became very heavy. The enemy advanced from their position, which was protected on either flank by a cypress swamp and strengthened by earthworks and 3 batteries of artillery. They were in great force, numbering not less than 10,000 men, with a regiment of cavalry on either flank, and apparently flushed with the hope of victory. Borton's brigade and the artillery with the 8th United States Colored Troops received them with a terrible fire, and checked for a time their progress. Their lines were depleted and swept down. Flag after flag would drop, but again appear, and the thin lines would close up calmly and quickly, and pour into our lines the terrific foe. The artillery was in constant play on both sides, being moved here and there, as the necessity of the battle required. Our losses were quite severe during this terrible conflict. The battle raged until the great disparity of our forces to those engaged against us became so evident that our line was gradually drawn back, leaving the dead and some of the seriously wounded on the field. At about sundown, the battle suddenly closed. The enemy ceased their fire so quickly that we were under the impression that they were about to make a grand forward movement in full strength, and endeavor to break our lines and gobble up our little army without regard to the cost of the effort. We fired but a few shots after the enemy had ceased firing and then prepared to withdraw. The retreat was conducted in the most orderly and perfect manner. There was no confusion, but little straggling, and no change in the spirits of the men. They were fatigued to be sure, but not in the least dispirited, but on the contrary, were as fierce for a fight as ever. The retreat for a short distance was conducted in successive lines of battle, but finding the enemy were not disposed to follow, the line was changed, the force retreating in column. Once or twice the enemy cavalry attempted to push our line, but were checked and driven back by our cavalry. March 1st, 1864, the New York Herald, written by Oscar G. Sawyer, correspondent. The Confederate cavalry went after the retreating Union a short distance and ended up with 150 prisoners. The Union eventually made it back to Jacksonville. The Confederates got 5 artillery pieces, 1,600 small arms, and 2 12-pound Napoleons from the battlefield. The Union destroyed the railroad on their retreat, and the Confederates repaired it on their way to Baldwin. When they arrived, they found a large amount of ammunition. Federal casualties totaled 1,861, 203 killed, 1,152 wounded, 506 captured or missing. Confederate casualties were 949, 93 killed, 848 wounded, and 8 captured or missing. The Battle of Olustee, or the Battle of Ocean Pond on the Confederate side, was the largest engagement in the Civil War in Florida. It was Florida's only major battle. It was a definitive Confederate victory, and the Union Army would never again go into Florida with such numbers. I hope you all enjoyed this one, folks. I definitely could not have done it without the research from some of the older books from the 40s and the 50s, and definitely that article from 1864 after the battle, that correspondent. Very, very helpful on this one, because you look up the information and there is just basically no information about the battle, not the details. And I could have made a 3-hour video on this with all the information I found, but I kind of cut it down. I used that newspaper article for most of the details. There's just so much details that I found back in the 30s, 40s, 50s written about this battle. Thank you for watching, folks. I hope you enjoyed this one, and we will see you on the next. Peace!